Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you all for coming today. Welcome to our subcommittee hearing on the status of the 2020 census. I want to start by welcoming a new member to the subcommittee, as well as a new member to the oversight committee, Fred Keller, who comes from Pennsylvania 12. Welcome. We're delighted to have you. And also, let's see, without objection, I want to wave on to the subcommittee today, Stephen Horsford from Nevada, who wanted to ask questions, and so by unanimous consent, we will grant him that privilege. Before I make my remarks, I want to thank our witnesses for their ongoing cooperation with our subcommittee. Mr. Goldenkopf, Mr. Marino, you and your staff have been truly excellent partners in this oversight process. So I want to thank you both. Dr. Dillingham, I also want to thank you for your work preparing for the 2020 census. I learned from my district staff earlier this month that you toured Silver Spring and Langley Park in beautiful Montgomery County, Maryland. These are diverse, high-density areas with a high concentration of immigrants where a variety of languages are spoken, and I really appreciate your coming out to check out our community. My district director, Kathleen Connor, met with your staff this month and was really encouraged by the Bureau's preparation. So I want to thank you and your staff for your hard work. That work, of course, is ongoing. We've got a lot to accomplish before 2020. We spent a lot of the last year embroiled in a battle over the citizenship question. Now that the administration has been forced to stand down by Congress and by the Supreme Court, the Bureau must devote all available resources to repairing the damage of this effort, getting us back on track and conducting a complete and accurate count in 2020. Although the move to impose the citizenship question has been rejected by the courts as arbitrary and capricious, I fear that it may still be endangering an accurate count in 2020. So I'm eager to hear about the aggressive steps that the Bureau can take and is taking to repair the damage caused by this ill-considered campaign. Every 10 years, the Bureau struggles to count everybody in America according to constitutional directives. Some communities, including communities of immigrants and people of color, are chronically undercounted. They then do not receive their fair share of government resources and everything from federal and state legislative representation to Medicaid and Head Start. The consequences of an undercount reverberate for decades. The Bureau's own study showed that distrust of the government imperils a good count. Among communities of color, 41% of Asian Americans, 35% of African Americans, and 32% of Hispanics are very concerned about the census being used against them. Similarly, 39% of people who are not English proficient and 34% of those born outside the U.S. are afraid to respond in the census. So there's a lot of fear in our communities that we've got to strive to overcome. The citizenship question, the president's executive order and his immigration policies, and the threatened raids all strike fear in the hearts of many of the communities that are already mistrustful of government. And even though the question will not be on the 2020 census, there is a test in the field right now where 240,000 families are being asked the citizenship question. Why is that? This decision to pose the citizenship question to hundreds of thousands of people after the Supreme Court rejected it seems hard to reconcile with the reality of the Supreme Court decision and the unbroken defeat of the question in the lower district courts. So now we face the threat of prolonged confusion, and I do hope we can talk about that. The Bureau must outline specific steps it's taking to increase outreach to the communities whose participation has been chilled. Specifically, the Bureau must reassure everyone of the confidentiality of the data collected. It must reaffirm its commitment that census data will not be used for law enforcement purposes. It must clarify the impact of the President's executive order on the confidentiality and use of census data, and it must identify specific actions that it will take to differentiate itself from law enforcement in the field. In light of the damage done, I think the Bureau should increase outreach to hard-to-count communities instead of sitting on $1 billion in appropriated funds. Earlier this year, the Bureau told Congress it tends to carry over $1 billion to FY20 instead of spending it this year. Why is that? I fail to see a compelling reason for the delay. The Bureau relies heavily on partnership specialists to create relationships in hard-to-count communities, but it's 2 months behind on filling 1,500 positions reportedly due to a backlog in background checks. But we can't afford this delay. Census staffers will soon begin knocking on doors. Shouldn't the Bureau be using the leftover funds or the existing funds to clear this backlog. Earlier this year, the House Appropriations Report ordered the Bureau to improve its communication strategy and to open questionnaire assistance centers, QACs, to reach communities missed in the Bureau's count. QACs would provide reliable locations in hard-to-count communities where people could seek face-to-face assistance from Census staff. QACs only cost the Bureau $27 million in 2010. Why isn't the Bureau using the carryover funds to open QACs as directed by Congress? The Bureau has been underfunded for many years. Now that it has been granted a healthy budget, it is refusing to spend it. Outreach for the census should be fully funded now. Finally, the Bureau should improve its processes for tracking and implementing security recommendations to safeguard data and avoid missing key deadlines. I'm alarmed to hear that the Commerce Inspector General recently found that the Bureau's IT systems contained fundamental security deficiencies that violated federal standards, indicating that the Bureau is behind schedule in developing its systems for 2020. This is a common theme. GAO has noted the Bureau is behind schedule on resolving 104 high-risk or very high-risk security vulnerabilities, and that it has no schedule or process for implementing security recommendations that were rendered by the Department of Homeland Security. That is not acceptable. The Bureau is home to one of the largest databases of identifiable personal information on the American people. The security of this data is paramount not only to a well-run census, but to the public's confidence in our system. I trust that the GAO has recommendations for the Bureau to get back on track, and I look forward to hearing its plans for that today. And now I happily will yield to the ranking member of the committee, my friend Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing. Obviously, this is not the first hearing we've had on the census. The decennial census is something that we've had under this administration and under the previous administration, where we've had timelines that we've been working on. So, Dr. Dillingham, we look forward to hearing from you in terms of how we're making progress. I do want to offer, I mean, this is Mr. Goldenkopf's at least ninth hearing, I think, as we look at this particular issue, because I know that when I was chairman of the Government Operations Subcommittee, this is of critical importance that we get it done right. And so whether it's this administration or the prior administration, my fear had been and continues to be, are we going to do those cybersecurity issues and the end-to-end testing to make sure that we can count on not only the privacy that the chairman talked about, but the integrity of the system. I will also offer a little bit of a counter narrative. We've spent way too much time on a citizenship question. It's time that we get serious about implementing this, and candidly, any direction that we continue to maintain as it relates to the citizenship question is problematic in terms of delivering and actually counting those individuals. I also know that there's a strong outreach. Dr. Dillingham, I want to thank you for the strong outreach to those, what I would say, more rural and underserved communities that the chairman was talking about. The funds that are allocated, I happen to agree that we need to roll those into next year, because I don't know about any of you, but if there is a thing that most Americans are thinking about today, if there's a top 20 list, Census doesn't make the top 20 list. I'm just telling you. They will make it. Will make it starting in March and April of next year. We'll start to see that, and that outreach needs to really be dedicated. But we need to have the systems in place now. And so what I would say is identifying those systems, making sure that they're there, making sure that the way that we collect the data, I know this is going to be a groundbreaking way that we use the internet like we've never used it before, but we tried that in 2010 and it didn't work. And so the last thing I think this chairman wants, or that I want, is to have egg on our face when it comes to actually counting every individual. And regardless of where you stand on whether the citizenship question should be asked or not, it is imperative that we count everybody. And it is imperative that we do that in a way where we can allocate not only the resources, the $650 billion or so that flows to each one of our districts, but that we do it in a fair and accurate way. And so I look forward to hearing from you on that. I've got a longer written statement that I would ask unanimous consent be added to the record.
Without objection.
I thank the chairman, and I apologize in advance. I actually have a meeting at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue that I have to get to, and so we've got other people coming in, but we've got staff that's paying attention, and so with that, I yield back.
Well, we appreciate that. We appreciate your very thoughtful remarks, Mr. Meadows, and we will release you to the uncertain fortunes of the Article 2 branch, and we'll stick right here with the Article 1 branch. But thank you for coming. I now have the pleasure of welcoming our witnesses. First is the Honorable Stephen Dillingham, Ph.D., who is the Director of the U.S. Census Bureau, Robert Goldenkoff, who is the Director of Strategic Issues for the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the GAO, and Nicholas Marinos, the Director of Information Technology and Cybersecurity at the GAO, at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. I will begin by swearing all of you in, so please rise if you would and raise your right hand. And Mr. Keller has been promoted very quickly to the ranking member of our committee. So do all of you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses all answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Please be seated. The microphones are sensitive, so please speak directly into them. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the permanent record. With that, Director Dillingham, you are now recognized to give an oral presentation of your testimony for 5 minutes.
Chairman Raskin and committee members, thank you for inviting me. This is an important time for the Census Bureau and the 2020 census. The census clock is ticking. We are increasingly ready, and we thank you for your support. Regarding the President's executive order, we are reviewing it. Steps have begun to form an interagency working group. We will share updates. Preparations for the census continue unabated, and execution is near. The census will begin in remote Alaska in less than 6 months. The nationwide count commences in 9 months in March of 2020. It is my opinion, one shared by the Census Bureau professionals, that we have an outstanding plan built upon best practices with cost savings and important innovations. We have teams in place and hirings are underway. Our teams are entering a high-performance phase. Hiring is proceeding, training's continuing. Safety and accountability are progressing. Currently, we are onboarding tens of thousands of address listers. We appreciate congressional help in recruiting them. With hurricane season here, we must be prepared for disasters and unforeseen events. When a disaster strikes, we can and will adapt. Information system readiness and cybersecurity are paramount. Our well-designed IT systems and integrated operations are working. We test for functionality, scalability, and of course, cybersecurity. Data is encrypted at every stage. We are working closely with government and industry experts. Oversight, accountability, and support are valued. First, we are committed to assisting Congress and this subcommittee. Second, we appreciate the work of the Government Accountability Office and Office of Inspector General. We agree the 2020 census is high risk, given its scope, complexity, and importance. Third, we appreciate bipartisan support, including continued funding. Appropriators requested a plan for additional funds. We developed an option to increase community partnership assistance and hard-to-count outreach. Our highest priority, as mentioned by the chairman, is to reach hard-to-count groups. We continue to identify and visit such communities found in all states and in urban, suburban, and rural areas. During my travels, I see partners reaching people in new and better ways. Counting children has been a perennial challenge. We are working closely with pediatricians and schools. We have plans to reach the homeless. Our partnership specialists from local communities and different backgrounds enhance these efforts. We have an integrated, research-based outreach campaign that messages for diverse communities. I often repeat the message that the 2020 census is easy, safe, and important. A member of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus recently suggested that I reverse that order. The census is important. It's important, increases daily. Data is used for apportionment and redistricting, and by governments at all levels in developing policies and administering programs for billions of dollars reaching millions of people. Funds support education, transportation, health and human services, safety, jobs, and more. It is used by government, businesses, and families. The census is safe. Census data remains secure with confidentiality protected. Congress passed stringent laws with severe criminal penalties of imprisonment and fines for violations. Census employees take a lifetime oath to protect our data. The Census Bureau sets the highest standard and maintains a culture and practice of protecting data. It is not shared with anyone or any agency. Finally, the census is easy. This is due to improvements in technologies. People may complete the census anytime, anywhere. Our language assistants will reach more than 99.6% of the population. This will be the first census ever where people may choose to answer electronically. If people prefer paper, questionnaires will arrive automatically in the mail. I've described our technologies and tools in context of a familiar story. Late at night, a person sees a friend under a street lamp looking for a lost item. The friend joins the search but is having no luck. He asks his friend, "Are you sure you lost it here?" The friend replies, "No, I dropped it down the block in the dark, but I'm looking here because the light is better." We can no longer rely on collecting data in the usual ways and places. With internet and phone options, we have tools to go into the less visible, hard-to-count areas and collect the data. In the boroughs of New York City, mobile devices can count in the street markets or among the students at Queens College. In Detroit, they can be used in civic centers and houses of worship. In South Carolina and Georgia, the technology can count persons displaced from closed mill villages or rural farms. In Silver Spring, Maryland, you can deploy the tools in community centers and commercial establishments like Korean Corner. In Baltimore, Maryland, libraries and recreation centers alone provide 80 locations with interconnectivity that can and will be used. Partnership specialists will work with community groups using computers and laptops and phones to count others wherever they may be, including homeless beneath the freeway. Options for reaching hard-to-count persons are limited only by imagination and initiative. In Baltimore, I met partners with great ideas and initiative. On the light side, I made an offer to the mayor to repeat a well-known act of a previous mayor. When the opening of the city's aquarium was delayed, that mayor publicly fulfilled his bet on the opening date by jumping with cameras rolling into the aquarium's seal pool. I made that pledge to Mayor Young last week. If the city's response rate matches or exceeds the state average, I would love to jump into the seal pool to celebrate the city's success. I expect to lose that bet. The Baltimore City's plan that I have with me was released on Friday. It is complete with extensive partnerships and a host of exciting innovations. I am optimistic about what I'm seeing across the nation. Preparations are underway, partnerships are increasing, interest and enthusiasm are growing. Working together, arm in arm, hand in hand, and with new technologies, expanded outreach, and community partnerships, we can conduct the best census ever, one that is complete and accurate. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dillingham. Mr. Goldenkoff, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Raskin and members of the subcommittee, GAO is pleased to be here today to discuss the Census Bureau's readiness for the 2020 head count. As you know, in recent years, we have identified a number of operational, IT, cybersecurity, and other challenges that raise serious concerns about the Bureau's ability to conduct a cost-effective enumeration. In February 2017, we added the 2020 census to GAO's list of high-risk government programs, and it remains on our high-risk list today. My remarks this afternoon will focus on two such challenges: implementing design innovations aimed at controlling costs and hiring temporary staff. My colleague, Nick Marinos, will then discuss the challenges the Bureau faces in implementing and securing critical IT systems. The bottom line is that as the countdown to Census Day grows short, the Bureau has made important progress toward mitigating some of the risks facing the census, and we are encouraged by the Commerce Department and Census Bureau's leadership commitment towards carrying out a cost-effective enumeration. Still, the Bureau estimates the census may cost as much as $15.6 billion, a $3 billion increase over the Bureau's original estimate, and significant uncertainties lie ahead. For example, with respect to design innovations, to help control costs while maintaining accuracy, the Bureau will use new procedures and technology for 2020, including greater use of automated data collection methods, administrative records in place of data collected by enumerators, verifying most addresses using aerial imagery and other in-office procedures rather than by going door to door, and allowing households the option of responding to the census via the internet. These innovations, they show promise for controlling costs, but they also introduce new risks, in part because they have not been tested extensively, if at all, in earlier enumerations. As a result, testing is essential to ensure that key IT systems and operations will function as planned. However, citing budgetary uncertainties, the Bureau scaled back operational tests in 2017 and 2018. Without sufficient testing across a range of geographic locations, housing types, living arrangements, and demographic groups, operational problems can go undiscovered, and the opportunity to refine procedures and systems could be lost. Another risk factor is the hiring of temporary staff, and in particular, the onboarding of partnership specialists. Currently, the Bureau plans to recruit approximately 2.24 million applicants, and from these, to hire over 400,000 temporary field staff for two key operations: address canvassing and non-response follow-up. According to Bureau officials, the nation's current low unemployment rate has not yet impacted their ability to recruit staff, and as of July 2019, the Bureau reported that for all 2020 census operations, it had processed just over 500,000 applicants. But at the same time, the Bureau was also seeking to hire approximately 1,500 partnership specialists by the end of June 2019 to help increase census awareness in minority communities and hard-to-count populations. The Bureau fell short of this goal with just 903 partnership specialists hired as of July 6. And as of July 17th, another 872 applicants were awaiting to have their background checks completed. The Bureau expects to have all 1,500 partnership specialists on board by September 1st, 2019. In the coming weeks, it will be important for the Bureau to hire and retain the full complement of partnership staff planned for 2020. Otherwise, it might affect the Bureau's outreach efforts to key communities at risk of being undercounted. In short, while the Bureau and Department of Commerce have taken steps to keep preparations for the decennial on track, additional steps are needed. Going forward, to help ensure a cost-effective headcount, continued leadership attention and strong congressional oversight will be needed to help ensure that the Bureau implements our open recommendations, that key components and systems work as required, that preparations stay on schedule, and management functions follow leading practices. This concludes my prepared remarks, and I now turn it over to my colleague Nick Marinos, who will discuss the risks facing the Census Bureau's IT and cyber systems.
Thanks very much, Mr. Marinos. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Raskin and members of the subcommittee. Thank you very much for inviting GAO to discuss the Bureau's efforts to prepare for the 2020 census. As Robert mentioned, our most recent high-risk report highlighted a number of IT-related challenges facing the Bureau. These include IT systems readiness and cybersecurity. The bottom line is that these challenges still remain today, and we believe it is important for the Bureau to overcome them prior to the 2020 census. Starting with systems readiness. The Bureau plans to rely heavily on IT for the 2020 census, including through the 52 systems it plans to use during different stages of census operations. Many of these systems will be deployed multiple times in order to add needed functionality over the course of 16 operational deliveries. The Bureau has delivered the first group of systems to support early hiring and training, and the next few months will see key testing and production deadlines for many additional systems. However, our ongoing work has determined that the Bureau is at risk of not meeting key IT milestones for 5 upcoming operational deliveries. These include deliveries in support of Internet self-response, a new innovation that the Bureau intends to rely on for a significant portion of responses to the census, and recruiting and hiring for peak operations, which includes hiring hundreds of thousands of temporary employees to assist with counting the population. The Bureau needs to closely monitor these schedule risks in order to ensure that the systems are all delivered on time. Regarding cybersecurity, the Bureau is working hard to assess security controls, take needed corrective actions, and gain the proper sign-off to ensure that each system is ready for operations. Although a large majority of the 52 systems have at least received an initial authorization to operate, significant assessment work remains. According to the Bureau, 9 systems will need to have their security controls reassessed to account for additional development work prior to the 2020 census, and 5 systems are still awaiting that initial authorization. I'd like to note that we've been encouraged that the Bureau is coordinating with the Department of Homeland Security on cyber issues. DHS has provided this assistance through cyber threat intelligence and information sharing, and through conducting incident management and vulnerability assessments, among other activities. All of these internal and external assessment efforts, including the recent evaluation performed by the Commerce Department's Office of the Inspector General, are vital, especially since the majority of the Bureau's systems that will support 2020 operations contain personally identifiable information. At the end of the day, however, they will only be as valuable as the corrective actions the Bureau takes in response to them. We recently made 2 recommendations to the Bureau for management attention in this area. The first called for the Bureau to address its security to-do list in a timelier manner, and the second called for it to establish a formal process for tracking and completing actions in response to DHS's assessments. The Bureau reported that it is working to implement our recommendations. If fully implemented, the Bureau will be better positioned to ensure that assessments will result in high-priority improvements to its cybersecurity posture. In summary, we're running short on time before key census operations begin. Moving forward, it will be critical for the Bureau to devote enough attention and effort to completing IT system development activities and implementing cybersecurity improvements in a timely and prioritized way. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement.
Thank you very much for that cogent presentation. Thanks to all of the witnesses. We will now begin our questioning according to the 5-minute rule. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to focus on the confusion caused by the census test that's currently in the field. Despite the administration's abandonment of the citizenship question in the wake of the Supreme Court decision, hundreds of thousands of households are now still being asked to answer it. In mid-June, while the case was pending before the Supreme Court made its ruling on June the 27th, the Bureau pushed a last-minute field test to 480,000 households, half of which got the citizenship question and half of which did not. The result has been confusion. Hundreds of thousands of people heard the news that the question wouldn't be asked, and yet they received a form from the census with precisely the question that the Supreme Court had rejected. Just last week, we got a phone call from a citizen wanting to know why she had received a census form with the citizenship question. I was asked that at a town hall meeting over the weekend. According to the Washington Post, one Florida resident who received the form said that receiving the test questionnaire, quote, feels like a scare tactic. So, Dr. Dillingham, everyone knew that the Supreme Court had to rule on the citizenship question case at the very latest by the end of June. Why didn't the Bureau wait until the end of the month to hear what the court's decision was before launching this test?
Mr. Chairman, that's an excellent question. Let me provide some context for you. The planning, this is actually a test. A 2019 test was designed for operational consequences and impact. So if the question was going to be in the census, we wanted to know what would be the differential impact for purposes of devoting resources, such as the partnership, such as the enumerators, et cetera. The planning for it began actually last calendar year. The printing occurred, I think, in April, and it followed a schedule as perfectly as possible, the same type of schedule that we would have for the 2020 census, and that is the staggered mailings, et cetera, response dates. It was to replicate as closely as possible the 2020 census. Now, the form itself on each page has, this is a test, and in the introduction it says, this is a test to help us prepare for the 2020 census. So anyone that reads the information, it should be quite bold, this is a test. However,
but if it says to get ready for the 2020 census,
that's correct.
It implies that the citizenship question will indeed be on the 2020 census.
Well, it certainly implies it's a possibility. So again, half went out without the question, half went out with the question, and our desire was to see what is the differential impact. So we followed the schedule, and actually, I think, I will double check, only one of the staggered mailings that I think stretched about probably 6 weeks, the same as with the census, or maybe it was a little more condensed, but 5 or 6 weeks I recall. It was already, before the Supreme Court ruled, 4 or 5 of those were already in the mail, and actually the last went out earlier this week.
Whose decision was that?
That was actually the career staff at the Census Bureau felt it was very important that we would know the operational impact for purposes of
So
resources.
you never made that judgment?
No, I did not make that decision.
All right, thank you. Mr. Goldenkopf, is it normal to have a large-scale field test like this close to the census? In other words, if we went back to the 2010 census, would we have found a similar test in 2009?
No, and I think this highlights the risk associated with last-minute design changes to a decennial census. Typically, the last major test is conducted in the 8th year of the decade, and so when you do this, and I don't, you could argue this was an important risk mitigation strategy.
I see that,
everything
yeah.
that was going on.
Yeah.
But and it'll take a lot of effort to kind of get the word out on what was this, and even though it says test on every page, it could still strike some concern.
Is it, Mr. Dillingham, just to be clear, is it still going on? In other words, are there still people, is that
All
why
the
we're getting
mailings have
calls?
been made, and we're getting the results. I did check last night, and out of the 480,000 that have been mailed, more than 200,000 have been returned. The only information we haven't looked at the content of the returns, but it does verify and provide some very important information for us, and that is with regard to both the 2020 census and potentially in the future, what kind of impact this may be. One of the things that you can tell just by looking at the basic data returning is that the hard-to-count areas, again, are responding at a much less rate than the other areas. So that's helping to verify that.
Are people being mandated to respond to the test? I mean, are you required to answer that question?
Mr. Chairman, actually, under the laws governing the Census Bureau, when we send out a survey, it does recite that this is pursuant to law and you are supposed to reply to it. That is.
So there are hundreds of thousands of people who, in essence, are being told they're legally obligated to answer the citizenship question right now.
Well, in context of a test, we do testing, all sorts of testing and surveys, and so it really is part of the routine business, but this was to look at the impact for operational purposes.
Okay, my time has expired, and I now recognize Mr. Keller for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. I just want to make sure that I understand. I know we talked about the importance of making sure we count everybody accurately so that money gets appropriated properly. I think another concern of the American citizens is the fact when they transmit information to the government that information is secure. And the question I have goes to the IT systems that we're putting in place. Are they government employees that do that, or do we contract the building of that software from private companies? I guess, Mr. Marinos, that would...
Yeah, so the answer is that contractors are leveraged by the Bureau, and so there is a significant responsibility on the Bureau to ensure oversight of those contractors.
Okay, so if we do that, you're confident that we have, and I guess Mr. Dillingham or Mr. Marinos, you can answer this, we're confident that we have accurately and thoroughly vetted these contractors to make sure that the information will remain secure and that there's no possible way for anybody to hack into it or get that personal information of American citizens?
I would defer to Dr. Dillingham.
Congressman Keller, we have very elaborate protections. As you're well aware, Title 13 requires by law that we protect this information. So we have existing security and that it goes into, but in the collection during the 2020 census, using the new devices, we have the latest state-of-the-art softwares and devices that encrypts the information automatically. It encrypts it when it goes into the device and when it's sent to the...
I understand that, but the companies that build this, we're sure that there's no way that there's anything built in that anybody can hack into this and gain access to the information.
I can assure you that, and we do, and there are the requirements, the security requirements for the contractors as well, and that we work with them and monitor them, and et cetera. And then it goes into our I'll call it our normal safeguarding systems. We do apply the state-of-the-art. We have the best minds both in the private sector and the public sector working with DHS, the intelligence agencies, as well as the major high-tech companies to look at this. And so I can assure you that we have identified no major issue that would be the type of breach that you...
We've identified none. And again, I just want a question regarding a $61 million printing and mailing contract issued by the Government Printing Office awarded in October 2017. It's my understanding that the company receiving the contract has filed for bankruptcy after they received a payment from the federal government?
Mr. Congressman, that does predate me, but my understanding is, and I think the record is clear publicly, that a contract was let out of the Government Printing Office, and the firm that it was given to had financial problems, and in fact, it resulted in a settlement and having to go with another contractor.
Understand my concern. If we as the federal government couldn't even vet a company as far as financial stability and make a payment to them, I think that we should have some concern that we'd be able to make sure that the company's building the software that American citizens are going to be using to transmit their information, that their information remains secure. I hope you can understand the concern that I have, and maybe you can speak to what processes have been put in, or let me ask this, have processes been put in place to make sure?
Yes, and I'm certain that, again, we had another federal agency involved that actually lets those contracts, the Government Printing Office, and I do know that both in our agency as well as in that agency, reforms were made, changes were made to guard against that in the future.
Another question, just real quickly. I understand, too, that we let a contract for a company, and the company was sold, and the contract sold that company or that contract or the subsidiary that was doing that to another company. Do we approve that if a company is offered a contract or awarded a contract and they sell that subsidiary or whatever that's their...
Mr. Congressman, I think I'd better get back and maybe with particulars from our acquisition folks as to what the federal acquisition requirements are and our adherence to those.
Okay. I guess the point I want to make, in securing the information that American citizens are required to provide to their government, I think should be paramount to all of us. And I've heard a lot of things about the citizenship question that was going to be asked. And that question should not be, citizenship should not be controversial. It's not new. But I think what our Committee on Oversight should do is make sure that when we require American citizens to transmit information to their government, that this committee focus on making sure that that information is secure and not going down a rabbit hole in something that should not be controversial or is not new in the form of a citizenship question. Thank you.
Congressman, we agree. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from the 1st District of Missouri, Mr. Clay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for conducting this hearing. As we know, the census is such an essential part of our government and of the operation of this country. Let me start with Dr. Dillingham. The marketing ad agency, VMLY&R, are they considered the Census marketing prime contractor?
Not to my knowledge, Congressman. The one we have is, we call it a Y&R, Young and Rubikoff, and that's the prime. Yes, maybe that's the full name. Okay. I apologize.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's who.
That is I'll call it the prime contractor, and we have at least 8 subcontractors that specialize, particularly with hard-to-count populations and special reach efforts.
Can you tell me what entity or entities are responsible for the African American media buys?
Congressman, we definitely have that information. People sitting behind me have that, and I'd be glad to talk with you and meet with you. And
can you provide that to the committee?
Absolutely.
Let me ask you, when purchasing ads for the census, must contractors pay media outlets in advance? And what is the time, and if that's so, what is the time frame for repayment? Is it 120 days?
Mr. Chairman, let me answer your former question, and I'm told that Carol H. Williams Agency is really the prime subcontractor with the African American population. The timing of the buying of the ads. Let me just, this week, today, the career professionals at the Census Bureau is working actually in New York City, reviewing the creative products that are going to be produced for all forms of media, television, radio, print media, et cetera. And out of that process will come the develop of the messaging and the materials and the creative products is what they call it. The actual buying of time, to the best of my knowledge, is probably late December, but I will get you exact dates for purchasing. And I know that discussions are going on, and there's a complexity because some of the information is considered to be somewhat proprietary.
And I do understand that, but when you have to pay in advance, do you think that that could inhibit some small minority-owned companies from really being able to engage with you and I knowing that we have to focus and do a better job on counting those hard-to-count populations. And so to have barriers in the place of these small businesses, it really doesn't make sense.
Yes. Congressman, I certainly agree with your concerns, and what I think we'd better do is get you some particulars as to the buying practices and the schedule dates. But I do know that another side of the coin is the sooner you buy the time, the cheaper it is. And so, but we can work with you and see what coordination may be needed.
And I would appreciate that. And Mr. Chairman, I would, and perhaps the Bureau could help me with this.
Yes.
I would request that the Bureau provide this committee with the names of the minority-owned subcontractor firms and minority suppliers participating in the Census 2020 marketing and advertising efforts for African Americans, the areas of the country and communities that they are responsible for covering, the value of awarded contracts, and when these contracts were executed. I also want to know how these minority suppliers and firms were selected. And finally, I would like to know how much money total is being allocated for African American media.
Yes. Congressman,
Mr. Director, can you help us
we'll be glad to get you
with
that
that
information.
information?
Yes. Some of it may not have yet been decided, some of the buys, but we'll get you what we have.
And you and I understand how challenging
Yes, sir.
it is
Yes, sir.
to count, hard to count communities. And so I want to work with
Yes, sir.
the agency in every aspect of this.
We join you with it
endeavor.
on that goal. Yes.
Thank you. My time is up, and I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from West Virginia, Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member Heiss, and thank you all for being here today. Democrats on our committee have been so consumed by the citizenship question, all the while that we could have been in this very room performing the necessary oversight to make sure that this census goes smoothly, safely, and most importantly, accurately counts the number of the people in the United States. If you look at the past decennial census, our committee is far behind in conducting the necessary oversight for the 2020 census. Now is our opportunity to finally get to work and do what the American people have sent us here to do. Director Dillingham, my district in southern West Virginia is historically one of the hardest to count in the country. Over half of my constituents, 51%, live in so-called hard-to-count neighborhoods. What is being done by the Census Bureau to make sure that constituents in rural, hard-to-count neighborhoods are accurately accounted for?
Congresswoman, as I mentioned in my opening statement, that is, in fact, the most important thing to the Census Bureau is reaching the hard to count. And I understand many of the obstacles and challenges in West Virginia as well as other states, and we are working on that very diligently. Let me just mention some of the very important ways. Certainly, we just mentioned the communications outreach plan. So we will have national and localized advertising on the census, reminding people how easy, safe, and important it is. And we hope we'll reach those communities. And I have seen communities such as yours that have special needs. Particularly, some communities listen more to the radio, perhaps, than television. There are other avenues. Some actually, particularly ethnic communities, look at their local newspapers, and particularly if it's a different language. So we have these outreach efforts. But another thing that we have done, which the chairman mentioned, is our partnerships. We have more than doubled the partnerships for this decennial census. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, we also, Congress asked us, the Appropriations Committee, to come up with, if we receive some additional funds, how would we use it? And we specifically provided in there that we want to continue some temporary employees during the census, if it's funded by Congress, to reach those hard-to-count communities and to deploy people with laptops and with phones, et cetera, to help reach them. But in the event that our public relations, communications, as well as our outreach efforts and the partnerships, even despite all the new resources we're applying to that and the new technologies, we ultimately have the enumerators who will be coming around and knocking on the doors. And they'll be doing that more efficiently, more professionally than ever before. So those are some of the things, but that's not an exhaustive list, and we totally agree with you that we want to reach those communities that are hardest to count. And I've seen that, and when I went to the Navajo Nation, actually, the Navajo Nation compares itself to West Virginia. It covers the same territory as West Virginia, but has its own set of circumstances, and we are working with them to make sure we can reach the hard to count.
That's good, because I know television seems to be a good manner,
Yes.
you know, because of the satellites and the rest, that they can be reached. Cell phones are another story.
Yeah.
Director, children under 10 years of age are the most difficult population to count, and this is doubly true in rural areas. What is the Census Bureau doing to make rural children, in particular, making sure that they'll be counted?
Congresswoman, another excellent question. And the children are hard to count in many areas, and even outside what we would traditionally consider hard-to-count areas, but particularly important there. There has been a problem with counting children since the census began. I saw some information shared with me back in 1850. People were commenting on that, complaining about it. Why is it difficult to count the children? Certainly the circumstances have changed and some of the factors have changed, but it has remained a perennial problem, counting the children. So we're partnering with organizations such as the Annie E. Casey Foundation, which has devoted staff and time and publications and others and other national organizations. We're focusing on that hard-to-count population in our communications campaign, as well as with our partnership specialists. We're working with a variety of pediatrician groups. We're working with the cities, we call it the Statistics in Schools program, which is designed for the Census Bureau in reaching the public schools to reach the children. But then finally, if we're not getting the results, and when we come around and ultimately may have to knock on the door, we have specially trained our people to ask special questions on, do you have any children living in your household, et cetera. And even on the online internet, we have a drop-down that reminds you about, are you counting the children? So we're looking at it from all angles. It continues to be a problem. We're working that problem. We're continuing to research that problem. But we have so many partners around the country that are also working on that problem. And we cherish those relationships to make sure that we're counting the children.
Mr. Goldenkopf, has the GAO...
Oh, I'm sorry, the gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you.
The chair will now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Dillingham, my questions will be directed at you. I want to focus on the Bureau's plan for questionnaire assistance centers in the 2020 census, which provide localized in-person assistance, as you know, in completing the census questionnaire, helping hard-to-count communities get counted. On July 1st, Senator Jack Reed and our colleague, Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence, who's a member of this committee, sent you a letter asking for details on your proposed mobile response initiative, which I understand is replacing the QAC program this year. Have you responded to that letter?
Congresswoman, regretfully, we have not.
When will you be responding?
as expeditiously as I can after this
More
hearing.
specifically, when will you be responding?
We will be responding very quickly, and I can
Within
give
the
you...
week, within 2 weeks, within 3 weeks?
I would envision within 2 weeks.
Within 2 weeks from now. Okay. Will you simultaneously provide a copy of your response to that letter to this committee?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Dillingham, I have some quick-fire yes or no questions for you. In 2010, QACs counted more than 700,000 people, correct?
I am not, I would have to check that.
I can assure you
Congresswoman.
that that's how many that the Census Bureau says they counted, which is more than the entire population, for example, of the state of Vermont. So, Dr. Dillingham, are there plans to open QACs across the country for the 2020 census?
Congresswoman, there are not.
So you're getting rid of these centers where more people than the
No.
population of an entire state were counted.
Congresswoman, let me explain that we are providing expanded advice and assistance and through other mechanisms
Okay,
than the local
I'm going to
centers.
get to asking you questions about that because I don't share that view. Is it correct that the FY19 Appropriations Bill report specifically directed the Bureau to open QACs?
That was not my understanding, Congresswoman, but
Okay, well, I have
they
it-
did ask us to look at it.
I have
and
it right
consider-
here on
Yes.
page 611 of the FY19
That's correct.
CJS Appropriations Bill,
That's
which
correct.
governs your agency. And it says, additionally, the Bureau shall devote funding to expand targeted communications activities as well as to open local questionnaire assistance centers in hard-to-count communities. It says shall.
Okay. And I think I don't want to differ with you on the language, but let me tell you how we're delivering that
Couldn't.
assistance.
It's right here in black and
That's
white
correct,
on page
but let me tell you,
611.
we're delivering more assistance than ever before, certainly the last census.
Okay, I have some more yes or no questions because I don't agree with your characterization. Are you aware, according to the census's own audit, that many of these QACs were budgeted only enough for 15 hours of staff time per week, or were only open during hours when most people are at work?
In the past census,
Yes.
Congresswoman, I know there were problems
Yes
with
or
those
no?
centers.
Are you aware of that fact?
Not those specific facts, but I knew there were problems.
Okay, and that the Bureau's own 2020 audit of QACs did not recommend eliminating QACs, but working to improve them. Were you aware of that?
I'm aware they wanted the function fulfilled. That's correct.
And did not recommend eliminating them?
The bricks and mortar, we didn't go that approach.
Did the Bureau consider increasing the availability and staffing of QACs instead of eliminating them entirely?
We have very much not only considered, but are increasing the staffing for that function.
But you just said you're not going to have QACs.
We
How are you
have,
going to increase the staffing for that
it's a matter of terminology, but when we have the mobile response units, we consider those.
Okay, I'm going
we
to ask you a
consider those.
question about the mobile response
Yes.
units in a moment. Earlier this year, the Bureau told Congress it intended to carry over more than $1 billion in
Mm-hmm.
funds to FY20 rather than spend it this year. Is that still the case?
We have carryover funding to guaranteed continuity of funding. That is
Of
correct.
$1 billion?
Approximately $1 billion, yes.
So there is funding, appropriated funding, available to you that you could be using immediately to open QACs with the census being right around the corner. Dr. Dillingham, will the Bureau commit to using some of the $1 billion, and I'm an appropriator, so this matters to me, in carryover funds to open QACs?
Congresswoman, my understanding is it's not feasible at this point in time.
I beg to differ. So let's talk about the mobile response initiative that you are touting. In a report the Bureau prepared for Congress, you criticized QACs because they required individuals to find a physical location set up at regular hours to provide assistance. Your mobile response initiatives actually are, for the most part, going to be two-person teams with iPads popping up at markets, festivals, and events. Now, I know from experience that unpredictable things like weather can affect turnout in events. I went to a festival in June for the Juneteenth, and it poured rain in South Florida, and no one came. How will two people with an iPad find critical mass in that way?
We have actually an interactive live system. We call it the ROAM system, which is the Response Outreach Area Mapping tool that we can monitor tracks during the census. And we can monitor self-response rates. We can target those tracks.
With two people?
No. We would have more. We would have more, and we'd have a multitude of partners. And so in our discussions...
Not according to your plan.
The gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it, and thank you, Dr. Dillingham, for your answers. You have some work to do.
Thank you.
The chair now yields to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And thank you for being here. I, too, am very glad that we're finally getting around to oversight on the census. I believe we are majorly behind the 8 ball at this point, and there's so many issues to deal with, from the IT component to overall strategy and performance and budget, staffing, on and on and on. But I'd like to begin, if I can, Director, on the IT component. This whole issue of cyber threats increasingly is becoming an issue across the board on so many different areas of our personal lives as well as business and government. Where do we stand on this?
Congressman, that is, one of the primary concerns, certainly of anyone following the census, but the GAO and others, it's something of concern with the Census Bureau. We've been working on it since the last decennial census. We're putting a lot of protections in place. We're working with the leading federal agencies. We're working with the DHS. We're working with their cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency very closely, visiting their facilities, and also working with them on a 5-pronged plan, which is the management, the intelligence, the network security, the response areas, the incidents, as well as the assessments. We are also working with the private sector. We're working with the leaders in the high technology industry. They're assisting us in many different ways. Cybersecurity is of concern, and GAO actually says it's a government-wide concern, of course, throughout the federal government. And we are doing everything we can to make sure we have the best minds, the best people, and the best policies and the best tools to deal with it. So we're making tremendous progress. We continue to work on it. Certainly by January, we will have our systems fully tested on cybersecurity, but cybersecurity remains an issue. We're all aware that across the globe that there's threats are posed, and we do scan. I do want to explain. We scan each month over 100,000 vulnerabilities. So we have an ongoing, very intense, very rigorous process for looking for those threats.
Okay, I would I would tend to differ with you on some of your, I mean, you have lofty words stating that you're ready and everything's pie in the sky. I have much more serious concerns with that. Mr. Marinos, what about you? There's going to be more IT involved in this census than anyone in our nation's history. Where do you see that we stand on cybersecurity?
It's definitely a key element to the high-risk area that GAO designated back in 2017 with respect to the census, 2020 census. Kind of two big things here. One is the additional testing that the Bureau has ahead of it with respect to cybersecurity. We're talking about having to reassess 9 systems out of the 52 and then assess 5 systems to get them to the point of a sign-off that says, yeah, we're good to go. On the other side, we credit the Bureau for the assessment efforts it's done to date, as well as the work that the Department of Homeland Security has done, but we'd really like to see that turn into corrective actions implemented. And so I think ahead of it, the Bureau has still some work to do when it comes to assessments, but more importantly, take those assessments and turn them into corrections within their cybersecurity program.
Absolutely, I totally agree. And Director, I'll come back with you. The Census Security Assessment identified 217 high-risk or very high-risk corrective actions that need to be addressed.
Certainly.
As I understand it, there have been 104 of those delayed.
That's correct.
That does not sound like you're on top of the ball here.
If I could, Congressman, I appreciate your concern, and we're concerned as well. But let me provide a little bit of context. We identified in the last year 150,000 vulnerabilities. And when we don't resolve those vulnerabilities, we create a plan of action and we establish milestones. And those plans of action and milestones is what GAO looks at. They look at the milestones that we have established. So we have an ongoing inventory of approximately 300 out of many, many thousands, and we have them coming off each and every day. As a matter of fact, I'm apprised that we do at least 100 a month. That's several every day coming off of the list and others coming on.
What's the chances you complete all of this?
There's no chance. There's no chance.
So it's not pie in the sky as you described it.
No, absolutely not. We're managing risk, and that's going to be until this census is completed. There will be risk identified and risk coming off. So we're working the list, and that's the way we do. And that's actually the way GAO recommends we do business: is risk management and risk mitigation, and we have the people and resources, and that's what we're working at. But I would never envision that risk list would reach 0.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Gomez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. While the citizenship question is over, I believe the ramifications of the question still remain. Fear and confusion in our community still exist, and we must ensure that millions of Americans, rich and poor, citizen and immigrant, are counted. Historically, communities of color and immigrant communities have been undercounted, while non-Hispanic whites have had a higher count. As someone who represents one of the most diverse districts in the country, this is a big concern of mine. California's 34th congressional district is home to multiple communities like Chinatown, Koreatown, and Boyle Heights, composed of a wide range of ethnicities and nationalities, with dozens of languages spoken in the district, many residing in multi-family households, and some living below the federal poverty level. All these barriers make the enumeration in my district difficult, making it one of the hardest to count districts in the country, with 42% of my constituents living in hard-to-count neighborhoods. More concerning is the 2020 census increased reliance on technology. Although it will have some positive impact, I'm also concerned about hard-to-count communities. For the 2020 census, the Census Bureau is pushing 80% of the people to respond online, with only 20% of communities receiving a paper form as their first option. But 35% of U.S. adults don't have access to reliable internet in their homes, including 53% of Latinos and 43% of African American communities. In my district alone, 1/4 of my district's households have no access to the internet. So the first question is, given that more than 35% of adults lack reliable internet, I'm concerned that the Bureau is pushing 80% of the population to respond online. Dr. Dillingham, what is the plan to increase responses in underrepresented rural and low-income communities that have disproportionately lower rates of internet access?
Congressman, that's an excellent question, and we are working the hard to count. But let me clarify some of the context. And we did, when we met last week with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, we also discussed some of these topics. But our language assistance will reach 99.6% of the population. And in those areas where there's a substantial Hispanic community, they will be in those two languages, both English and Spanish. The 80% figure, I apologize, I've never heard before, and we don't use the 80% figure. Okay. It actually, if we received 80% of people responding electronically, that would be a mammoth accomplishment, but we don't expect that. We're actually aiming, I think it's 60.5, and we will have to see how that comes out. But the paper, I just want to remind everyone, the paper, if a person does not respond online or by phone, they're going to receive the paper. And in the hard-to-count communities, they receive the paper questionnaire in the first communication. We send out 5 mailings to the communities in the hard-to-count, and many of those, they'll receive it in the first mailing, and then they receive it again in the 4th mailing. So every household that hasn't responded will receive a paper questionnaire that they can submit. And in some instances...
Let me follow along
Yes.
with that. I've been informed that some advocates said that the Bureau identified that 20% of the communities will receive a paper form first. Is that correct?
Well, I'll have to look. One of the things we do, I think if the community, if the area is 20% of Hispanic, for example, okay, then they will get the paper, the first mailing.
So a lot of advocates and a lot of groups that are working on this want to know the list of communities that will receive that paper ballot first. Could you make that list of communities available?
I would not see why not. I'm not sure. It could be a moving list, but we will work with you on that.
Okay, I appreciate that. If someone wants to answer on a paper form that is not included on the 20% of communities, how can they get one?
Again, it will be mailed to them. So they should receive. They should have. They'll get 5 mailings. If they're in the hard-to-count communities, as we were describing, they will get it the 1st and the 4th. Now, the normal, I'll just call it the non-hard-to-count populations, receive it on the 4th. So in these mailings, they will come to their household a hard copy on paper.
Okay. Well, I'm almost out of time, but. The National Association of Latino Elected Officials, NALE, reported that only 20% of Latino participants responded digitally in the end-to-end test in Providence compared to 70% of the general population. Does that comport with your understanding?
I don't have I wouldn't challenge that at all, but I will check on that.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming forward. This is an important issue for all of us. I believe that the citizenship question would have had a huge negative impact on the count. I'm glad that's resolved, but we're still going to work to make sure that you get the resources and we get everybody on board to ensure a complete and accurate count. Thank you so much.
Appreciate your support. Thank you so much.
And I yield back to the chair.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Dillingham, I want to thank you for being here today. Please know that Congress is a partner in this endeavor.
Sure, absolutely.
And as evidenced by this committee, we plan to stay engaged and to do the work today in 2019 so we can be ready in 2020. I represent the Massachusetts 7th Congressional District, which includes Boston. Boston ranks 9th amongst the 100 largest cities where it's hardest to count. And we see that undercount resulting in really stark disparities and inequities in the district. Plainly speaking, if you aren't counted, you don't count. And there are so many communities, from the LGBT community to renters, who are unseen and not counted. So today I'd like to focus my questions to the Bureau specifically. Dr. Dillingham, on July 11, 2019, an executive order was signed directing the Commerce Department to obtain citizenship data by other means. Dr. Dillingham, in light of the executive order, will the Bureau be producing block-level data on citizens and non-citizens? Yes or no?
Block level, I would, at a level they will, of citizen versus non-citizen from administrative data, that is correct. The availability at block level, I'm not quite sure, because it's a complicated thing, but we also have some very important protections at the basic level. We call it disclosure avoidance, where we inject noise into the data. So what level is yet to be determined.
I see. Has anyone in the administration indicated to you that block-level data produced by the Bureau will be used to target neighborhoods for immigration enforcement? Yes or no?
Congresswoman, I'm aware of concerns about the Census Bureau never does any law enforcement. We're prohibited from law from doing it. Only thing that we release are statistics, aggregate numbers, and we protect the privacy. So the data is made available to the nation. So but I can tell you.
Sorry, just reclaiming my time, and
Yes,
my time is short
right.
here. What would you say to those who are concerned about this block-level data being used for that purpose? Because I understand what you're saying here, but how do you communicate en masse what you're saying that you don't corroborate in that way?
Very important, and one of the things that we're doing right now is the messaging for our outreach campaign to make sure they understand the security that's in place and why they should not be afraid to complete the census. But also what's very important are the trusted voices, such as members of Congress, others in the communities.
Excuse me, my district is 40% immigrant. I can't even begin to count. In our Boston Public Schools alone, there are 150 different languages.
Sure.
So do you have the staffing resources to communicate in the most culturally competent of ways, given the diversity of districts which are historically undercounted?
Well, we do have the language assistance at 99.6%, and then once we enter the enumeration phase, our enumerators are trained to get the assistance. We have special, even to outreach to even to the handicapped or the people with special needs of all types, and so we will, through our enumerators and through our partnership specialists and through our outreach campaign, will address those needs.
Okay. Can you confirm for us today that the citizenship data collected pursuant to the executive order will not be used in the Bureau's apportionment counts?
In the apportionment accounts, let me get back to you on that.
Do you believe it should be used for that purpose?
I don't have any belief whatsoever. I just need to know the mechanics, Congresswoman, and I'll get back to you on that. But
Please do. Is it possible you could get back to me with an answer in the next 10 days? Specifically on this
yes.
question, if you plan to use this data collected pursuant to that it will not be used in the Bureau's apportionment count? Can you give me an answer on that in writing?
I don't see why I couldn't.
Okay,
I
wonderful.
don't have the answer.
Okay. Will the information be used in determining the allocation of federal resources for Medicaid or for CHIPS, for the Children's Health Insurance Plan?
Congresswoman, we don't determine the uses of it. We just produce the numbers.
Do you believe it should be used for that purpose?
We hope that our data is accurate and complete and is useful for many purposes, but all the federal programs totaling more than 675, some people estimate it could be close to $1 trillion. We hope that our data that they're using is very accurate, complete.
Okay. Have you or anyone you know of discussed including citizenship data in the redistricting file?
In the redistricting file. Congresswoman, let me get back to you on that.
I would love to understand if you've had those conversations and what was the nature of those conversations and who participated.
If I can only refer you to the executive order that we're going to be looking at and putting the administrative data together, I can refer you to that. So whatever that executive order says.
All right, Doctor, my time has expired. I now recognize the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney.
I thank the chairlady for yielding, and I thank all the panelists for your testimony today. It's a very busy last week here in Congress, and I thank you for all your hard work, all of you. In the past 2 years, it's shown that the census is vulnerable to political manipulation when the citizenship question was added. In fact, our nation was one vote on the Supreme Court away from erasing an estimated 8 million people, professionals said, from the formulas we use to determine who represents us and who governs us and how we distribute over $700 billion in federal funds yearly. And we really cannot allow our country to be in that position again where really the accuracy of the census is questioned. So my first question is about a bill that I authored called the Census Idea Act, which would prevent arbitrary and capricious harmful questions from being added at the last minute, really over the objection of the professionals at the Census Bureau and many others. And the way you would prevent that is require by law, basically the administrative code as it exists now, and required in law testing periods for each question, additional reporting to Congress on that testing, and certification by the GAO that tests were adequate before forms can be printed. And this bill, in my opinion, would allow the country to be protected from what Judge Furman called in the one of the decisions, capricious and arbitrary addition of questions to the census. Basically to have the formula, actually it's the formula that's in the administrative code, but the Census Bureau decided not to follow the administrative code. So I would like to present this question to all of you in writing and with the bill and give you a chance to see the bill. And particularly GAO, I'd like your responses to it on whether you think it would prevent capricious and arbitrary tampering with the census in the future so that it is well thought out, approved, done in the proper procedures. And I think it's important that we not only make sure that everyone's counted, but that we prevent any type of behavior that undermines the accuracy of the census. But now, moving forward, and would all of you respond in writing to this question and to viewing it? I'd appreciate it. Okay, thank you. Now, I really want to talk about the neighborhood partnership specialist, and I understand that that is critical. We have the Census Bureau up and running in New York now, and the director there says that these partnerships are very important, and that we need to have them fully operational partnerships, that they're essential to the 2020 census. And I'd like to really ask, first of all, Mr. Dillingham, do you think these partnerships are important? And are you, the Bureau's goal was to have 1,500 partnership specialists on board by the end of June. And I'd like to know, did we meet that deadline? Maybe I'd ask Mr. Goldenkopf, since you wrote about it. And how far behind is the Bureau? And then I'd like to hear from Mr. Dillingham whether we can move forward quickly to get this in place.
Sure. Well, thank you. That's an excellent question. As you know, partnership specialists are so important in terms of convincing people, particularly populations that are traditionally undercounted, to participate in the census. They're the so-called trusted voices. The Census Bureau had planned to hire around 1,500 partnership specialists by the end of June of this year. They fell short of that goal. As of July 8th, they had only 813 partnership specialists hired, and they hope now to reach that full complement of 1,500 by September. So already the Census Bureau is 2 months behind on this important effort.
So, Mr. Dillingham, as I understand it, the delay in hiring is caused by massive backlog and background checks, and the Bureau is about to embark on a massive hiring effort where it will seek to hire roughly 15,000 workers for area census offices and non-response follow-up. And if the Bureau can't handle the 1,500 background checks, how in the world is it going to handle 15,000, which I understand is your goal?
Congresswoman, I certainly appreciate it, and I certainly agree with your observation on how important the partnership specialists are. And as a matter of fact, when I met in your office in New York City, we had partnership specialists with us, and I addressed the whole region's partnership specialists in a phone call from the van while we were outside your office. We appreciate, and I also noticed, besides this partnership specialist, we shared with you the information where you had the longest list of the members of Congress whose districts we had in terms of your partners, and we commend you on that. But on the partnership specialists, we have made more than 1,600 offers. Majority are on board, but we're waiting for a few that, and as pointed out, we're going to be on track, on time. So within 30 days, they'll all be boarded. We envisioned 1,501, but in fact, we've made offers to more than 1,600. In addition to that, as I mentioned with the Appropriations Committee, we presented an option that Congress, for Congress to consider, that we could, in fact, besides the 1,500, which doubled from the last decennial census, we could have up to 5,000 assistants that would assist the partnership specialists, and that would be from continuing on our assistant recruiters who have already gone through the hiring process and have the computers, and they could be dispatched to assist the partnership specialists. So there is a mammoth effort being made in devotion of resources to this topic. And in our hiring, we are presently hiring, as you're well aware, the address canvassers, and we have
but my question is, not the 1,500, you're going to move forward on that, but you're supposed to hire another 15,000 non-response follow-up workers, and if you're having trouble hiring the 1,500, how are you going to hire the 15,000 with the background?
I appreciate your concern, but we haven't reached the stage yet for the non-response follow-up. That will be in our peak hiring, and we'll be advertising later. But right now, we have over a 500,000 applicants in our system. More than 600,000 have gone to our website and begun the process to apply for jobs. And we're hiring currently 40,000 out of that 500,000. So at this point in time, we were very pleasantly surprised at the job pool that was out there.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
May you give me 2 seconds more, 3 seconds more?
Okay, one final question.
For a GAO question. Mr. Dillingham, will you commit to providing a detailed plan to GAO and to this committee on how you will improve the background check process and stay on schedule? We want you to stay on schedule, and I'm sure you're going to do it, but let us know how you're going to do it.
Congresswoman, we certainly will. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
Thank you very much.
And may I thank the chairman for being a visionary on the census and in so many other
I appreciate that. The gentlelady from Illinois is now recognized. Ms. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and if I'm redundant, I apologize. I had other hearings. Dr. Dillingham, the 2020 census will use cloud technology to store data from respondents, correct?
That is being pursued. That is correct.
The Commerce Inspector General investigated the Bureau's cloud-based IT systems for the 2020 census and found what it called fundamental security deficiencies that violated federal standards in the U.S. Department of Commerce policies. Are you familiar with this report?
Yes, I am.
In that report, the IG office writes that it found severe risk to 2020 Census Cloud environments. Dr. Dillingham, the 2020 Census Cloud environment is where residents' confidential data will be stored, correct?
That is correct.
And the IG's office found security issues that left critical systems vulnerable, quote unquote, and found that basic security practices were not fully implemented to protect Title 13 data. Why have basic practices not been implemented to protect data, which is considered among the most confidential under federal law?
Certainly, Congresswoman, and let me fully explain also that there was no breach of the system. And as revealed in that report, as the system was being set up, it really was an access issue, and we do involve contractors, and there was and I'm going to generalize it here, but there was corrective actions were taken to make sure that no one had this special capability of accessing the system, and they further identified the problem of when you have data on the cloud, you need plans in place to take it down so that none of that data remains. And so those were two things. We very much respect the findings of the Inspector General. Immediate action was taken. It was some time ago. It involved contractors in setting up the system. But by the time of the 2020 census, those corrective actions have already taken place, but we'll have more by the time of the 2020 census. Thank you.
Thank you. The report concludes many of these deficiencies indicate that the Bureau was behind schedule. Mr. Marinos, do you agree that the Bureau rushed to deploy IT systems with truncated IT security testing, as the IG indicated?
Yes, and in fact, we've previously reported, based on the Bureau itself, identifying that there were time constraints that resulted in shorter timeframes for testing during the 2018 end-to-end test.
Okay. And Dr. Dillingham, the IG's report indicates that the Bureau agreed to implement all of its recommendations.
Let me explain as a matter of course. We appreciate these people looking over our shoulder. They see our timelines, they see our milestones, and they hold our feet to the fire. If we're not meeting those milestones, they remind us. We appreciate it greatly.
So you will confirm here today that you will implement each and every recommendation?
So far, I think we've agreed to all. Maybe there's one that was actually post-2020 census, but our normal practice is to agree and to take corrective action. That is correct.
And how are you doing on your timeline with completing the recommendations and repairing the fundamental security deficiencies, as was said?
Certainly, there are certain areas, and the ones they were tracking, we're making tremendous progress. The majority corrective actions have been taken. Some are underway. And so we monitor it each and every week, and we're looking to see the progress that's been made, and we'll continue to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Marinos, will GAO be tracking the Bureau's progress on the IG recommendations?
Yes, we coordinate very closely with the Inspector General's office on related reviews and on a continual basis talk about the status of recommendations. I believe there were 8 recommendations made by the Inspector General's office within that report, several of them that we think are vital to implement as quickly as possible.
And have you received a plan on how this will be accomplished?
We haven't. I think it would be best to defer to the IG on those specific recommendations, but I would say that this relates also to our more general recommendations around corrective actions and ensuring that the Bureau is prioritizing all of this good feedback it's getting from these sources and making decisions on what to tackle first.
Additionally, the GAO, in its monitoring of the Census Bureau, found that the Bureau is at risk of not meeting near-term IT system development and testing schedule milestones for 5 upcoming 2020 census operational deliveries. Mr. Goldenoff, can you tell us what those 5 are and how they are delayed? And how delayed they are, I should say.
Yeah, I'll defer to...
Sure. The 5 operational deliveries relate to peak recruiting and hiring, and internet self-response, remote Alaska counting, and then group quarters enumeration, both advance and enumeration activities. In terms of where they are right now, there are multiple milestones related to each of these deliveries, and again, across the 52 systems, several systems may be touched at different times. I think that the most important and most critical ones are going to be based on what operations are coming up. We did see, to the Bureau's credit, address canvassing from when we were recently tracking in the spring come off of the at-risk list, and that is an operation that's starting up in August, but we will continue to monitor the status of these deliveries as well.
Okay. And they all sound very, very important and critical to the success of the 2020 census. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady's time has expired. We now go to the gentleman from the 4th District of Nevada who's waved on today, Mr. Horsford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Raskin, and thank you very much for allowing me to be here today to speak about the importance of the U.S. Census, particularly for the African American community. Just yesterday, the Congressional Black Caucus, under the leadership of Congresswoman Karen Bass, our chair, launched a new census, the 2020 Census Task Force, of which I will serve as chair. One of the goals of the task force will be to partner with the Census Bureau and coalition stakeholders to ensure an inclusive, complete, and accurate 2020 census count. We will also work to increase the participation of all communities, but specifically Black residents as well as Black immigrants, and ensure a fair and accurate count of all people across the United States. During the last census count in 2010, African Americans were undercounted by over 800,000. That is totally unacceptable, and we must close the gap and ensure higher participation in the 2020 census so that all communities that need federal resources are able to receive them. So my question is, first, does the Bureau have a goal or plan to improve the Black undercount and increase participation?
Mr. Congressman, we certainly do, and I agree with every statement you just made. There's nothing more important, no higher priority than reaching the hard to count. And among the hard to count are certain populations, including the Black populations. And so we're engaged in that. We're doing it through the ways that I've mentioned in terms of our communications campaign, in terms of our partnerships. But I want to commend you that one of the most important things is to have the groups at the local level that have formed the task forces, the complete count committees, working with your stakeholders. We cannot conduct the decennial census without the support of the Congress and the communities and the partners and the state and the local governments. And I commend you for doing that. And we have given toolkits to all members of Congress, and I know many are helping us in so many ways.
Thank you.
Appreciate your help.
And I look forward to reviewing that plan. Has an analysis been done to determine the impacts that the consolidation of the census offices will have on hard-to-count communities? For instance, we learned within our CBC task force meeting that there is only going to be 6 regional census offices to serve the entire United States. So what analysis went into the decision-making to reduce by half the number of census offices, and what steps are being done to remedy this issue?
Mr. Congressman, the regional offices mirror our regional offices that are in place permanently, and so that's where the 6, but we have 248 area census offices, which is, in fact, we had a discussion earlier, it's a reduction from the past. But let me explain to you that in reducing those offices, we're beefing up the mobile response so we can take the devices directly into the community centers, into the churches, into the areas of need.
What was the justification for cutting by half the offices? There were over 450, and there were 12 regional offices. If you could just get back to us with any...
I certainly will, but let me just say generally, it was the conclusion of the professionals at the Census Bureau who have done many, many decennial censuses that it was not cost effective, that we had better technologies, we could reach people better, devoting more resources to reach those people, and the bricks and mortar in many instances was not working. The General Accountability Office has said that this decennial census cannot follow the same practices of the past. That was one of the areas where we saw a great opportunity for improvement.
And one of those areas is to have it completed through the internet. However, many hard-to-count communities do not have access to the internet. So what are the Bureau's plans to help ensure seniors, low-income populations, and others get counted?
Again, that is one of the areas that we're working the hardest on, and we think we have a lot to show. The tools we have with the internet and the telephone options where people can answer anytime, anywhere, are very important to the hard-to-count communities. In Columbia, South Carolina, they're putting Wi-Fi in the city buses. People on their way to work can get on their phone and answer the census in less than 10 minutes. It's very important that we apply all these technologies to the hard-to-count communities. We're in total agreement with you there. the bricks and mortar idea is sort of gone. If I could do the analogy, it's like if you're in the volume pizza business, you usually have a delivery service now, and we need to reach these people in the most efficient, effective way possible, and working with the groups that you're part of enable us to do that. When we go to a community center, we expect, yes, we will have a partnership specialist there or an assistant, but we will have dozens of people from that community, volunteer organizations, partners, stakeholders, et cetera, that will be working with us, and that really makes it happen and gets the job done.
Thank you, Mr. Dillingham. The gentleman's time has expired, and I'm going to recognize finally the gentlelady from Massachusetts just for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just picking up on my previous line, Dr. Dillingham, regarding the diversity of throughout our country, but certainly the district I represent, the Massachusetts 7th. As I said, nearly 40% of my residents are foreign-born and speak languages other than English. You spoke to me a little bit about how you plan to engage those communities and to you've got a big job in combating a lot of the misinformation and hate and fear that has been stoked. I want to use this platform responsibly here. If one of my constituents comes across something on social media or in the mail, for example, that they believe is fraudulently representing itself as part of the census, how should they report that?
We will have procedures in place to do that. Particularly, we will have, through our customer assistance centers by phone, people can pick up the phone and say, hey, someone's in my neighborhood, there's something on the internet.
Is there a number that you can share today, a number, an email address, or a website they should go contact or report to?
On the website, I will double check to see what our website will have, but there should be certainly referral information, and there should be procedures in place exactly to report that. We are working with law enforcement nationwide to make sure they're aware of that problem.
All right. Is there any process in place where people can contact you to find out whether a document is a legitimate 2020 census document? Specifically for that, I think there is, but I will verify it and get back to you. Okay. On both of those, I just would appreciate
certainly
having information that we can promote on our platforms to combat any fraud.
Absolutely.
Thank
And
you.
fraud is one of the things that we're certainly working with other agencies and groups to prevent.
Thank you. I yield.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. I want to thank Mr. Heiss for his patience. I want to thank all the members for their participation today, and I want to thank the witnesses for excellent testimony, and we will look forward to working with you for the most successful possible count we can get in 2020. Thank you for your testimony.